Good evening. I want to welcome you back to our Sunday night sermon series on the commands of Christ. Tonight we're looking at Jesus' 15th command, and it comes from Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 3. I've titled the message, "We Need to Judge Not." I want to read Matthew 7, 1 through 5, actually, instead of just 1 through 3, where Jesus says to his disciples, "Judge not, that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck." Now, taken all together, we tend to think that these verses are about judging, and they are. But primarily, these verses are about our relationship with God, our relationship with others, and even ourselves. In Matthew 7:1, Jesus says, "Judge not, that you be not judged." Now, here's what Jesus did not say. Jesus did not say here that we should never judge, that we should never point out sin in our brothers and sisters' lives, or that we would never receive correction from others ourselves. In fact, the first verse I just read to you says, "Judge not." It follows with 4 more verses that tell us how we're to judge. 4-1. I think it's okay if we judge. The entire sermon is a contrast between the standards Jesus has for his disciples and the standards that the scribes and Pharisees have set for themselves. In all of their rule interpreting and rule keeping, the Pharisees had elevated themselves above others while requiring others to carry a heavier load than themselves. In short, the Pharisees had become judgmental and self-righteous. In contrast, Jesus' disciples were to consider their own sin before pointing out sin in the lives of others. In this way, their lives would look different than those of the world, as they would confront others over their sin in a spirit of love and grace and humility. This is what you got to know. If you get your relationship with God the Father right, all your other relationships are going to flow. I don't mean that all of your relationships are going to be good all the time. I only mean that your relationships with others are going to be about as good as they could be. We need to be serving our brothers and sisters in Christ more than we are judging them. Only God knows them for who they truly are. Only God knows their complete background and life and story. Jesus displays here a certain sense of humor in this account when he compares a speck of sawdust to a log or a plank in one's eye. Understanding the vast amount of shortcomings that we ourselves have, we're to be offering a helpful spirit to those in need rather than a condemning and a critical spirit. So with that background in place, let's get to the heart of the passage here. What it's really about, okay? Relationships, not judging, our relationships. In verse 1, we see that the scribes and Pharisees, they had an erroneous view of God. That means they didn't see Him right. Didn't see Him the right way. They were playing God themselves with their unrighteous and unmerciful judgments on people. In verse 2, we see the scribes and Pharisees, they also had an erroneous view of others. Somehow the scribes and Pharisees felt superior to other people, and they also felt that they were exempt from judgment themselves. They had forgotten that God did not have double standards. They had forgotten that God is the final judge that will judge them. They would indeed be judged in the way that they had judged, much like Haman was when he was hanged on the gallows that he had hung up for Mordecai, if you remember the book of Esther. Finally, in verses 3-5, the scribes and Pharisees, they also had an erroneous view of themselves. Self-righteousness is a sin of blindness. It's grossly distorted vision because it looks at its own self and sin, and it sees only righteousness for some reason. It justifies itself and condemns others because it judges itself on its own standards, on its own wisdom. Or we could say the worldly wisdom. Self-righteousness is the worst of sins because when you get down to it, it just boils down to unbelief. It trusts in itself rather than God. It claims to be lawyer and judge in its own life and in the lives of others. The self-righteous person sees no need for grace or the gospel because he or she sees no sin in their own life. John MacArthur says, when our sin is cleansed, when the log is taken out of our own eye, then we'll see our brother's sin clearly and be able to help him. Then we'll see everything clearly, God, others, and ourselves. We'll see our brother as our brother on our level with our own frailties and needs. And this right balance of humility and helpfulness is reflected in Psalms 51. And David first prays, create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a steadfast spirit within me. Restore to me the joy of thy salvation. Sustain me with a willing spirit. Then David's able to say, I will teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners will be converted to thee. Jesus told Peter that after he recovered from his own moral defection, remember when he betrayed Jesus, the rooster crowed 3 times? Jesus said, then you'll be able to strengthen your brothers. Paul advises us, brethren, even if a man is caught in any trespass, that means sin, you who are spirituals, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, lest you too be tempted. All confrontation of sin in others must be done out of meekness, not pride. We cannot play the role of judge, passing sentence as if we were God. We cannot play the role of superior, as if we were exempt from the same standards that we demand of others. We must not play the role of hypocrite, blaming others while we excuse ourselves. MacArthur goes on to say, there is also danger, however, even for the truly humble and repentant believer. The first danger is of concluding that we have no right to oppose wrong doctrine or wrong practices in the church, lest we fall into judgmental self-righteousness. We will then not be willing to confront a sinning brother as the Lord clearly calls us to do. The second danger is closely related to the first. If we're afraid to confront falsehood and sin in the church, we'll be inclined to become undiscriminating and undiscerning. The church and our own lives will become more and more in danger of corruption. Realizing the impact of sin in the assembly, Peter made a powerful call for a confrontive, critical church when he said, for it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God. As believers, we must be discerning and make proper judgment when it is required. Michael Wilkins says, true disciples do not judge one another inappropriately because they have experienced God's mercy and forgiveness and so will extend to others that same mercy and forgiveness out of gratitude to God. God judges so differently than we do. He actually judges in a way that's really inconceivable. What am I talking about? Well, imagine that you murdered someone and you go to court, you know full well you're going to be found guilty and either will be executed on death row or you're going to have to serve a lifetime sentence. You go through all the trial proceedings and you get to the end when all of a sudden the judge himself, he steps out of his seat. He makes a judgment that you have been found not guilty. You think to yourself, what's happening? I know that I killed that person. I deserve to pay the time for the crime. At that moment in time, the judge looks at you knowing your thoughts and it says, I know you're guilty too, but I've declared you innocent. Someone must pay for the sins of this murder, though, and I've opted to take your place and your punishment. At that moment, the guards come and take the judge away, while you get to walk out of the courtroom scotch-free. Now, I know that none of this in our own way of thinking, man's wisdom, right, makes any sense. But that's how it works in God's economy. The wisdom of God is foolishness to man. Jesus the Christ stepped off his throne of glory. He came down to this earth to live as a man and willingly chose to take the punishment that you and I deserved. Only God could come up with a plan like this. Man, in all his sinfulness, doesn't think this way. As I've said before, man, we usually want retribution, but He offers us forgiveness. Wilkins goes on to say, one of the most significant keys to my life as a disciple of Jesus Christ is balance. I do not go so far as to say that balance is the key, but rather is a key that has helped me to deal with many difficult issues. The kind of balance I affirm arises from a phenomenon that pervades much of life. In our day-to-day existence, some of our most profound intellectual pursuits, we often encounter dilemmas produced by paradox. The kind of balance I advocate means to take two seemingly opposite truths and live with them both at the same time, even though we may not be able to understand completely how they fit together. For example, we may not be able to understand completely how God's sovereignty and man's responsibility coexist. We all have the experience of seeing both principles worked out in day-to-day experiences of life. We need to both to hear God's direction and to seek out His direction. Both principles are essential for helping us function effectively as we walk with God in real life. At first, it may be simpler just to take one side of the issue or the other, but we'll be wiser, better informed, and more well-rounded with a balance of both. Throughout the Sermon on the Mount, we've had to resort to balance to understand Jesus' full teaching on the nature of kingdom life. We saw, for example, that Jesus exhorted His disciples to let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Yet later He admonished, be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men to be seen by them. So a balance of both advises us to avoid the temptation for both personal cowardice and religious vanity by the adage, show when tempted to hide, hide when tempted to show. Or again, we're not to be anxious about what we eat or drink. Talked about that last week, Matthew 6:25-34. Yet if a person refuses to work, he's not to be supplied with food from the others in the church, 2 Thessalonians 3:10. This calls for a balance of God's ever-present care and our personal responsibility. We're told by Paul that we can rest in who we are because of our positional righteousness in Christ. That's Romans 8:1. Yet Jesus tells us that we should press on toward perfection. In Matthew 5:48, I already talked about that command. So Wilkins says here, I find a balance of those principles in the expression restful dissatisfaction. Y'all have heard me say before, holy discontent. So in our section tonight, we come across another issue that requires us to balance two truths. It's a paradox, right? We're not to judge, 7:1, yet we're to be wisely discerning, 7:5. To be an accurate judge, a person must know the accusation, have all the evidence, hear both sides, render a verdict impartially, and then carry out the punishment according to the law. Absolute judgment, which only God can do, is prohibited. Yet a relative judging or evaluations of a person's behavior is required. Wilkins concludes his thought by saying, living with a sense of balance has been a very helpful tool in my interpretation of Scripture and in applying it in my own personal life. But sometimes the attempt to be balanced can cause us to read into truths a balance that is faulty or unnecessary. In that case, striving for balance can actually lead us to error or compromise. The analysis of paradoxes can also be such a consuming task that we can end up in intellectual burnout, leading to immobilization. Rightfully approached, proportional living is a fulfilling way of thinking and exploring all of life because it leads us into the fullest realization of truth. But it's also the most demanding because we're always thinking and weighing our actions and our thoughts. We must recognize that we're always in the process, but the pursuit of the goal to understand and apply all God's truth is what will enable us to keep us balanced. Well, and speaking of balance, some of you probably remember the cookie illustration that I shared with you a few months back when I taught on the command that we're to go the extra mile. And I'm not going to give you that full illustration again, but I said something to the effect that, going the extra mile means giving the person who wants one of your two remaining, homemade grandma, made by grandma cookies, giving them both cookies. And that would be hard to do. But I have another cookie illustration that I want to share with you tonight that expresses the truth of tonight's command. And this story or poem is entitled The Cookie Thief. Here we go. A woman was waiting at an airport one night with several long hours before her flight. She hunted for a book in the airport shop, bought a bag of cookies, and found a place to drop. She was engrossed in her book, but happened to see that the man beside her, as bold as he could be, grabbed a cookie or two from the bag between, which she tried to ignore to avoid a scene. She read, munched cookies, and watched the clock as the gutsy cookie thief diminished her stock. She was getting more irritated as the minutes ticked by, thinking if I wasn't so nice, I'd blacken his eye. With each cookie she took, he took one too. When only one was left, she wondered what he'd do. With a smile on his face and a nervous laugh, he took the last cookie and broke it in half. He offered her half, and he ate the other. She snatched it from him and thought, "Oh, brother, this guy has some nerve, and he's also rude. Why, he didn't even show any gratitude." She had never known when she had been so galled, and sighed with relief when her flight was called. She gathered her belongings and headed for the gate, refusing to look back at that thieving ingrate. She boarded the plane and sank in her seat, then sought her book, which was almost complete. As she reached in her baggage, she gasped with surprise. There was her bag of cookies in front of her eyes. "If mine are here," she moaned with despair, "then the others were his, and he tried to share." Too late to apologize, she realized with grief that she was the rude one, the ingrate, the thief. I'll share one more illustration with you tonight that's titled "The Angel." And I'd probably title it, "Be Careful What You Pray For." I'd probably retitle it. Nonetheless, here it is. Dodie Gadient, a school teacher for 13 years, decided to travel across America and see the sights she had taught about. Traveling alone in a truck with a camper in tow, she launched out. One afternoon, rounding a curve on I-5 near Sacramento in rush hour traffic, a water pump blew on her truck. She was tired, exasperated, scared, and alone. In spite of the traffic jam she caused, no one seemed interested in helping. Leaning up against a trailer, she prayed, "Please, God, send me an angel, preferably one with mechanical experience." Within 4 minutes, a huge Harley drove up, ridden by an enormous man sporting long black hair, a beard, and tattooed arms. With an incredible air of confidence, he jumped off and, without even glancing at Dodie, went to work on the truck. Within another few minutes, he flagged down a large truck, attached a tow chain to the frame of the disabled Chevy, and whisked the whole 56-foot rig off the freeway onto a side street, where he calmly continued to work on the water pump. The intimidated schoolteacher was too dumbfounded to talk, especially when she read the paralyzing words on the back of his leather jacket, "Hell's Angels, California." As he finished the task, she finally got up the courage to say, "Thanks so much," and carry on a brief conversation. Noticing her surprise at the whole ordeal, he looked her straight in the eye and mumbled, "Don't judge a book by its cover. You may not know who you're talking to." With that, he smiled, closed the hood of the truck, and straddled his Harley. With a wave, he was gone as fast as he had appeared. The virtue that corresponds to our command tonight is the virtue called discernment. The intransitive verb of the word discern in Webster's dictionary means to be able to see or understand the difference. Despite the good deed by the Hell's Angels, you ought to be able to discern just by the name of that organization itself that Hell Angels is not a club you should ever want to join. Likewise, though, you ought to be able to discern that due to the image of God, that all man has been created in his image. Traces of goodness can be found in the most vilest of humans.